Hello everybody, welcome back to Read and Reread. My name is Angelia and it is time for Friday Reads. I did not do a Friday Reads last Friday because I was out of town, so this is kind of a double-wide Friday Reads with some books from the last couple of weeks. And I do also plan to do an April wrap-up probably next week because I looked back in my journal and April was abundant. I read a lot. I wasn't really aware of it till I started looking back, and there was a lot. So I do want to do a wrap up of April because it was a good reading month. So let's talk about the past week or so. First of all, in the world of television viewing, we did finish season 2 of The Wire. It was really good. This is the season where the story takes place with the people on the docks, and the story itself, the plot, was excellent. The character development, and this is really a character-driven show. But the thing that was funny was the technology, because luckily they don't depend on this. This isn't one of those stories that depends on gadgetry for solving the crimes necessarily, but more about like human foibles. But the technology, there was just some funny moments because they start to track the shipping containers, and when they show the screen, everyone gathers around. They're like, oh, look what it can do. And it looks like the original version of Uber. Like they're just like do things going across the screen. And then at one point they get this idea about tapping a cell phone, and somebody says, well, just think about it. There must be hundreds or maybe even thousands of people using these. And everyone's thinking, oh. So if you set that aside, it was really good. Now we're taking a break and we're watching the last season of Better Call Saul, and again, just really absorbed in that. So that's what we're watching. But I want to get right into the books because there's a lot. First of all, I have a quasi DNF, and let me explain. So I talked in my, I guess it was my TBR, about George Saunders and how I'd never read any. And so I did check this out, and finally I got down to where there was 2 stories left, and I realized I just was done. I don't want to read the rest of them. So is that still a DNF if I read all but 2? I guess it is because I didn't finish. So it's a mostly F, and now I'm saying F to the rest because I'm done. But my overall thoughts. The stories are not bad. A couple of them really stood out to me, but I was not wowed in any way. And I felt like the speculative fiction was kind of, I don't even know what the word is. It's not amateur. This is a very experienced and acclaimed writer, but I feel like the themes that he comes to over and over again have been handled in more skillful and surprising and nuanced ways in other things that I have read. And he deals a lot in the speculative fiction with themes of oppression and fascist government tendencies, and what if this keeps going. And he's clearly remarking upon trends in our current political atmosphere. If it kept going in this direction, what happens next? And I think these are really worthwhile themes to explore, but I don't know that they were successful in all of these stories. I think in the best of them, he really gets into this interesting concept of what happens when oppression gets to the point where people are just self-oppressing and self-censoring all the time as a survival technique. And what happens then if somebody suddenly decides to break out of that and start a kind of a counter-revolution or a counter-demonstration. And then some of the stories aren't speculative at all. So my 2 favorite stories in the collection were Mother's Day, which had to do with, I talked about this one earlier, it kind of reminded me, it had a little bit of a Flannery O'Connor vibe. And then also the story Ghoul, which this was a super weird story. This was my favorite of the speculative stories. It takes place in an underground amusement park. It's completely underground, and none of the people in it have ever been in the above world. Like, they have lived their entire life cycles, and generations of people have lived down here, as the employees at this amusement park. And it has different theme areas. There's a Victorian area and a Descent into Hell area and a Wild Wild West area. So it's sort of like a very bizarre, I don't know, I'm thinking of the 70s when there would be a theme park with a whole theme, you know, like Wild West or whatever. And there was one called Frontier Village that we used to go to when I was a kid. But anyway, they live in this theme park, and there's all of these rules about things that they do and don't talk about or mention. One of which is that there are no visitors to the theme park. They just work there and they run all these areas and rides, and nobody comes. And they're not supposed to bring this up. If you break these rules, something very dire happens that everyone participates in, but I won't tell you because it would spoil it. But this story was kind of a mashup of the lottery and 1984 in this decrepit, weird underground theme park. So that one I liked for just its weirdness and its appalling commentaries. I wasn't really into the title story that I think was supposed to be a real stunner, but it just kind of, I don't know, it didn't work that well for me. So I'm kind of on this collection, but I am willing to try 10th of December and see how that sits with me. So I'm glad that I did try George Saunders, and it was kind of a meh, but I tried. So let me know if you read Liberation Day and what your thoughts were about these stories, because I just got to a certain point and I've read enough of them, and off it goes back to the library. But then I want to talk about Jane Austen. As you can see, I wore my, well, you can't really see, my Captain Wentworth letter t-shirt. So you know that this is not my first time reading this book, probably my third or fourth. I love this book. I love Persuasion. Persuasion and Pride and Prejudice are tied for first place in my Jane Austen love-a-thon. And I just really loved re-entering this book and these characters once again. I will try to be careful about spoilers because I know there are some people who have not yet had the immense pleasure of reading this. All right, Persuasion is about Anne Elliot. She's one of three sisters with a very vain, silly, spendthrift, ding-dong of a father, and only one of the sisters is married. Anne was in love about 8.5 years ago with Frederick Wentworth, who at the time was a young up-and-coming captain, naval captain. But at that time, he did not really have any money yet, and his prospects were uncertain. And although they were very much in love and wanted to get married, Anne was only 19 at the time, and the family advice was to hold off and not marry him because she might be destined to be poor. She got this advice largely in part from her friend Lady Russell, who was a close personal friend of her mother, who passed away when Anne was a teenager. And Anne has always relied on Lady Russell. Lady Russell really does love Anne and want the best for her, but her advice kind of stunk because they were very much in love and she thwarted it. And we understand from the story that we understand why Anne accepted the advice, because she was very young and was still at the age where at every impasse of life, you ask your parents what they think. And her father is silly, and she didn't have a mother, and Lady Russell was the closest thing. And Lady Russell, you know, there's been a lot of discussion about this character, about whether she's kind of an accidental villain. She gave the advice that she thought was right, but it really was based on a lot of Lady Russell's preoccupation with social class and wealth. So that was what happened. So Anne has had a couple of opportunities since to get married and has passed them up because she was not in love with these people, one of which was the man who goes on to marry her sister Mary. To me, Mary is hilarious in this story. She is such a pill. She is a hypochondriac. She's a drama queen. She's that person that most of us have known in real life, in our family or maybe at work, who everything just hits her wrong. Like the way you're supposed to react to something, she's always going counterclockwise, and everyone's always having to smooth her down and get her out of the funk. And Anne's the one who's really the best at doing this. So Charles, her husband, is good-natured and puts up with all of her emotional shenanigans, but Anne's the one who really can kind of move her along in these things. So Anne is taken for granted by her family, and there's definitely something at work in this story where the people who do not value Anne are kind of the nitwits of the story, and the people who see Anne's worth are all of the kind of the virtuous characters. So anyway, Anne and her family, you know, they decamp to Bath because they need to rent out the family mansion because her dad has frittered away too much money and he doesn't want to adhere to economical modifications of lifestyle, but he does agree to go to Bath and rent out the house to make a little money. All right, so I'm not going to go into a whole synopsis of the story, but many occasions are set up for Anne's path to cross with her old lover, Captain Wentworth. And I will not tell you all the things that happen, but the story is rich with fabulous secondary characters. The plot is not particularly intricate or surprising, but there's so many good pieces of dialogue in here. And of course, the infamous letter. And that's not the only letter at play in this book, which leads me to the comment I want to make about letters. I'm going to put a video in the notes that Roz at Scally Dandling About the Books made recently about epistolary novels and their possible demise. And it's a great video looking back at a lot of wonderful epistolary novels and ruminating about whether or not we're going to keep seeing new editions in this literary category. So do watch and enjoy that video. And I was thinking about that when I was reading Persuasion, which is not epistolary, but there's the one really famous letter and a couple other letters that are important as well. And I started to think about all of the books where a letter is really pivotal in the plot or in the character development, and how if a letter writing itself is dying, not only will epistolary novels die, but letters and books in which a letter is key to the plot may die as well, unless it's a historical fiction piece. Jane Austen did write an epistolary novel as a teenager, which is Lady Susan, which is absolutely delightful and I highly recommend. But outside of that, most of her books do have significant letters in the story that somehow advance or obstruct the plot or shed light or confusion onto the characters. And so that would be another interesting video maybe for Jane Austen July about the role of letters in Jane Austen. Anyway, let me stop talking about this one book. I have other books to talk about, but I love Persuasion. All right, moving right along. All right, the next thing that happened was a reading mishap. So we went on a little trip the other day to visit my daughter at school. And when I go on a trip, I get a little bit nutty trying to pick out my book, because I need a book. First of all, I have to pick a book that I either haven't started or I'm only a little ways into it so that I won't run out of book on the trip. And then it has to be a certain kind of book. And I usually look for something very fast-paced, like a mystery or thriller, something suspenseful and engaging, but yet not too literary or not too dark or deep or complicated or challenging, so that because there's distracting factors at hand. So I had selected this murder mystery, City Under One Roof by Iris Yamashita. I talked about this in my May TBR, and you're going to find out right now why I did not read it on the trip. Stephen recommended it. It sounded really good. It's about a city that is entirely in a high-rise building because of the harsh conditions in the part of Alaska where it is located. A murder happens. It's kind of a closed room mystery because they get blocked off and into this high rise, and the detective is trying to solve who amongst this weird cast of characters might be the perpetrator. So I picked this up at the library. I picked up several books that had come in on hold, and they were in a stack, and my reading journal was on the top. So I was packing for the trip, and I grabbed my journal and my book, put them in my bag. I get to the hotel that night, and I pull out my book ready to read, and I put the wrong book in my bag. I pulled out Maybe You Should Talk to Someone by Gottlieb, a book that I had requested so that I could take a look at it and see if I wanted to read it for Mental Health May. Now, I was shocked. It was like record screech, and I was just, wow! Even though I want to read this, it jumped out at me and horrified me. It's like being all set for one meal and then you get a different one. Like you've been thinking all day about Italian food and pasta, but then it turns out you're having Tex-Mex. And you love Tex-Mex, but your taster was set for the pasta. So here it was, and I had no other recourse but to go ahead and read this book. And I thought, oh, well, how is this going to work? It's nonfiction. I just don't know. Well, reader, let me tell you, it turned out just fine, and I really enjoyed this book. So I am ahead of the game. I have read my Mental Health May book already in the mere outskirts of May, and so I guess I have room to read another book if I wish. But this actually I really did enjoy, and I don't want to say too much about it because I know a lot of people are getting ready to read it, but I really liked it. It is about a woman. It's about Lori Gottlieb. It's a memoir, and she is a therapist in LA, and she writes about her experiences as a therapist, and she has a very interesting personal story of how she came to be a therapist and the career detours and things that she did before becoming a therapist. And on the occasion of a surprising and abrupt breakup with someone who she thought she was going to marry, she's really thrown for a loop and having trouble processing what has happened. And so she starts to see a therapist. And so her experience of working through some issues that of course are not just about the breakup with her therapist, and in looking at her role in her work and as a patient. It's really very interesting and engaging. Her personality is very appealing, and she's funny, and I enjoyed this a lot. Now, I'll say more about it later on in the month. But so it was an accident, but it turned out to be a happy accident. And I still have the other book left to look forward to. All right, so then I read something really, really different, and that was The Deep by Rivers Solomon. And this was a book that I read for Trans Girl April. Rivers Solomon is a non-binary author, and I know that I've seen several people reading a few different books by this author this month, and they all sound very interesting. And one time I checked out a different book by Rivers Solomon, but I didn't get around to reading it, and it was I'm going to have to put the title down in here because I forget what it was called, but it was a different science fiction book. And I know that Brian at Bookish did read that book this month and found it very interesting. So I may circle back and check that out at another time and read it, because I never got to it before. This book was inspired by a song called The Deep by the band Clipping. That band is comprised of Daveed Diggs, William Hudson, and Jonathan Snipes, and Solomon gives them credit here on the book as well. And I will include a link to a video of the song. And the song is about the practice in the time of slavery and ships bringing slaves to countries that practice slavery. And pregnant women or women about to give birth or women in labor were sometimes thrown overboard because it was just too much trouble to deal with what was going on, or they were just sort of a liability as a cargo. And so the imaginings of this novel are that those women who are thrown overboard in the process of giving birth, the child that they gave birth to changes form and becomes a creature that can live underwater, the Wanjinru. So the Wanjinru they're not, my first thought was, so mermaids, but no, they're not mermaids. They don't look like mermaids. Their anatomy is more aquatic in appearance than human. And in fact, they refer to humans as two legs. They're, as best I can picture it, they look like a human-sized fish. They have fins, they have a tail, but they have a hairless area on their faces and on their bellies. What's really interesting about the Wanjinru is that each individual is anatomically pretty much the same. Everyone has the same structure, and they choose their identities and genders themselves. The main character is Yetu, who is the memory keeper for the Wanjinru. There's always one person who is the memory keeper, and everyone else just has sort of a vague sense of their heritage, and one person holds all of the traumatic history of the people. But she's having difficulty with this role, and there's a once a year ceremony where she lets all the memories out, and everyone has to experience all of the feelings and emotions, and then she takes them back. And she decides, one year she just feels very overwhelmed and trapped in this role, and she leaves. She makes a run for it and just decides that they can survive with or without her, and she swims away, and she meets some two-legged people. I don't want to tell more about the story, but it was really different. The atmosphere, the way that Solomon describes the sensations of someone who lives under the water, the way the water pressure affects you, the way of the quality of light in different parts of the ocean, and the way that they communicate. And it was just very sensual, and the story was very touching. I don't want to tell too much about it, but it was surprising and different, not like anything else that I have read. And River Solomon is just an interesting find for me as an author, and I do want to look up more of their work. I would call this one a fantasy. The other one that I heard talked about sounded more of science fiction, but The Deep was really, really fascinating read. The book that I just finished last night is one that I cannot discuss because of BookTube prize judging, and that's Trespasses by Louise Kennedy. I've now finished 5 of the 6 books that I need to read for the judging. I am haunted by the perpetual not arriving back at the library of Kaikii, the one I have mouth problems with saying the word correctly, but I am still waiting for that. I might just break down and go buy one, because I feel a little bit tense about the length of the book and the time remaining. So anyway, that's another story. I did read Trespasses. I am looking very forward to being able to talk about this book at the end of the judging period. And as I have mentioned, I am going to make a video about the 6 books, my reviews of them, how I decide to rank them, and but right now I'm sequestered and cannot discuss, but I want to. All right, which leaves us with what I'm currently reading, which is Pet by Akwaeke Emezi. And this will be my last book officially for Trans Girl April, although I did get a notice that The Death of Vivek Oji just came in at the library, so that'll just be a May book. And this is a young adult novel that Emezi wrote. It was a National Book Award finalist. It is a book that is frequently banned or challenged in libraries, public libraries, and school libraries, because it is a young adult book with a main character who is a trans girl, and she is living, it's sort of a dystopian story. I haven't gotten very far, but I have learned that she lives in a community called Lucille. And apparently there has been some sort of an upheaval in society where people who are referred to as the monsters, who are basically oppressors of freedom and liberty and choice, have been eradicated by the angels, who are the agents of good. And there's a society without violence or strife or bigotry or persecution. And Jam is the main character. Jam's mother is a painter, and her latest painting is of a creature who looks like a monster. And Jam accidentally releases Pet, is what the name that they choose for this character. She accidentally releases Pet from the painting, and Pet tells her telepathically that I'm not sure what Pet's gender is. Pet says that they are here to hunt down a monster, and that the monster, where I have left off is Pet tells her that the monster is residing at her best friend Redemption's home. So that was a very suspenseful place where I left off, but it's a great setup. I can't wait to see what happens. All right, there it is. That's what I've read the past 2 weeks, and I'm excited about what's right around the corner. I have on deck a wrap-up video and a haul video, waiting for a few stray orders to come in, and then I have a book haul, and then getting into the May content. So let me know what you have read this week that you loved or despised, and I will be checking in again in a few days. Have a great weekend. Bye-bye.